before I start, in answer to that applause, I want to make a pitch for the 3A Studio Blood Drive. I'm sure you've seen their posters throughout the school, and that's made you want to give blood. So on Wednesday, October 8th, beginning at 12:30 in the afternoon and till 5:45, you can make an appointment on a sign-up sheet posted throughout the school in order to give blood. And students from 3A will be around to answer any questions you might have about the blood drive. The whole process takes 1 hour. After you check in, a nurse will give you a physical checkup to see if you can actually donate blood. But the donation itself will only take 8 minutes. And afterwards, you'll get juice and cookies to replenish your body, okay? So everyone think about doing it. Well, I'm very happy to be here tonight because this is kind of the culmination of something that started, I guess, about a year ago in my life, in which I was sitting at home, as always, and then the phone rang, and it was the book review editor of the LA Times, and he said, I have a book that I think you'll really like. And he said, it's a book about the suburbs. It's very short, but I think you'll be really interested in it. Can I send it to you to see if you'll review it? I said, fine, mail it to me, and I'll take a look. And just the next day, an ex-student, a former student of SCI-Arc, called me up and started to tell me about the same book, which was called Holy Land, and said, this is a book you'll really love. So I got the book in the mail, and I read it, and it was a fascinating book. So I said, yes, I'll review it for the LA Times. And then they gave me like 3 months to do this book review, so a long, long time. And I kept putting it off, and I kept putting it off. And then finally, I called up the book review editor, and I said, I can't review this book. It's too good. This book is so good that I really don't have anything to say about it. And since by then there was only about a week left, and all the time they had given me, this might sound familiar to some of the students here, the book review editor was cajoling me into doing it and saying, oh, I'm sure you can do it, there's no problem, just sit down and write it, and if there are any problems, talk about it with me. So I actually did sit down, and it was the hardest thing I think that I've ever written in my life, and something that I wouldn't really say is particularly well written. There are words in it that I don't really even like. But I think the book, Holy Land, is the best book I have ever read on the suburbs. I think it is the best book on the suburbs. And it does, in a literary way, what generations of scholars have really failed to do, which is to portray the suburb in all of its shades of gray ambiguity. To say everything, really, that I think almost anyone can say about a suburb. And it deals with so many complex issues that I would be really hesitant, again, to take on the same task that I had to deal with in this review, which is to reduce them and recapitulate them in ordinary language. Because this book not only takes on all of these complex social issues, issues of the built environment, issues of the way Americans live, but it does it in a really poetic and very, very beautiful way. So without saying more about that, I would just urge everyone to read this book. I think it is a classic, and it's going to be a very enduring book. And so I'm very happy that we have Donald Waldie here tonight, who is going to talk to us in ways that we don't even know about Holy Land, a suburban memoir. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Margaret, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for your kindness in being here. You who are not deterred by the somewhat cryptic title of this lecture, a special lecture in urban studies. I am not an architect or a planner or an academic historian. I am not a theorist. I have only a passion for memory embedded in narratives. Because of that passion, I'm at best only someone who tells stories. They are very short stories about suburban places. You may find them not ideological enough or too simple-minded or simply implausible. Suburban stories are poorly understood because our frame of reference often stalls at sentiment or contempt. You may not think these stories add up to very much, and I tend to agree. Not adding up is part of the condition, I guess, of being postmodern. That is, seen from suburbia, postmodernism looks like the situation of heterogeneous assemblages that resist being cohered into a unifying theory of everything. The form of tonight's storytelling is also heterogeneous. It is simultaneously an assemblage of photographic and video images of a particular suburban place, an assemblage of personal and corporate narratives, and an assemblage of aphorisms on the condition of Los Angeles. It is the presence of these disparate and disarticulated parts together on the same stage that makes postmodernism seem a lot like vaudeville. And so tonight we have a melodramatic slideshow of true pictures and false memories of the suburbs. This is what we think we remember. I'll follow that with a critical analysis in the form of a personal narrative. This is what I remember. That will be followed by a video program which reprocesses the same memories as an argument. To a degree, this is what the community remembers. And we'll end this evening, with your patience, with some aimless strolling around the ideas of redemption, faith, and irony in our suburb. And now we're going to look at some slides. We're going to begin with a story we already know. These are photographs of Lakewood, the city where I grew up and where I still live. With the photographs are a few words and phrases from the story of suburban places. We think we know the suburban story so well that you and I don't need more than these few words to remind us. The whole story will rush in so completely and finally that the story needs no further narrative. So, this melodramatic part of the lecture then will be delivered silently. Well, those are wonderful images, don't you think? They are from the golden age of gazing in the early 1950s, when a picture really still was worth 1,000 words. How cool and ironic these images are, most of them made by the telephoto lens and the aerial photographer. Tradition has elaborated them into a convention that equates unlandscaped structures and unpeopled yards with alienation and violence, or what the architectural theorist Anthony Wiedler called the architecture of the uncanny. And so, just to give you an example, the photographer Louis Baltz says of his pictures of the banal details of housing sites under construction, with images of flat concrete walls, aluminum siding, and doorways that open into dirt yards, he says, quote, "Coming from Orange County, I was trying to find a vocabulary to mediate my sense of unspeakable horror at being born when and where I was." Sometimes I think of these pictures as pornography. Like pornography, these pictures are distractions. They replace the ordinary with an image that seems to invite abuse. At the very least, as pornography does, they invite our gazing at them. Norman Klein, in his recent book about Los Angeles called The History of Forgetting, discusses the problem of replacement in the story of Los Angeles. He names the problem of replacement, he calls it erasure. Klein is talking about the way successively built over landscapes in Los Angeles suffer from their erasure and our loss of a communal memory about them. Distraction leads us to misidentify the actors in the story we're telling. Erasure encourages us to appropriate only the favored parts. It might be useful to extend Klein's observations about erasure. Our story of suburban places has been so manipulated by processes of substitution, based in part on the compelling power of images like those we just saw, that the suburban places themselves are nearly erased. This isn't simple distraction or even mere forgetting, I guess in my book. I'd call it, by a technical term from neuroscience, I'd call it agnosia, the inability to know now that something was once known. I like this line that comes near the end of Klein's History of Forgetting. He says, "For a world as ruthlessly distractive as this, I am calling for less elegance and more confessional uncertainty on behalf of all that we are about to forget." What we are forgetting, erasing, substituting are the stories of our own lives. The modernist program, the program that dominates this century, I think, suggested the end of these personal stories and offered to replace them with authority. In my view, nothing is sacred in modernism except authority, which must be demonstrated repeatedly by acts of will on the landscape. And so the modernist program disallowed the burdensome sacredness of memory or its evocation in the built landscape. Unhinged from memory, the modernist program had no place for the contingencies of our lives, the ordinary circumstances that overpower what seems to be a direction in history. Aphoristically then, memory defies authority and its power to substitute other memories. Memory puts the past to use. Memory is labor. The sharing of memory is part of the communal work of people who live together. Shared memory is social labor. Buildings are part of the persistence of memory. The historian Patricia Limerick emphasizes that filling in erased history, in her words, and I quote, launches a constant process of disorientation and reorientation. Much of the writing about suburban places has stalled at the situation of disorientation and has not picked up the burden of encompassing reorientation. For the next few minutes, then, I'd like to share the disorienting and reorienting experience of my own personal narrative. I'll read some sections from my book called Holy Land, a Suburban Memoir. After that, we'll see a video program, Patience Willing, which was produced by the city I work for, which reassembles similar memories and attempts to make them collective. Now, my book, Holy Land, is 316 short segments, some of them only a sentence or two in length. Each one of them is numbered. And I'll read you the section numbers here just to provide a certain disorienting orientation to Holy Land. 12. In 1949, 3 developers bought 3,500 acres of Southern California farmland. They planned to build something that was not exactly a city. In 1950, before the work of roughing the foundations and pouring concrete began, the 3 men hired a young photographer with a single-engine plane to document their achievement from the air. The photographer flew when the foundations of the first houses were poured. He flew again when the framing was done, and later when the roofers were nearly finished. He flew over the shell of the shopping center that explains this and many other California suburbs. The 3 developers were pleased with the results. The black and white photographs show immense abstractions on ground the color of the full moon. Some of the photographs appeared in Fortune and other magazines. The developers bound enlargements in a handsome presentation book. I have several pages from one of the copies. The photographs celebrate house frames precise as cells in a hive and stucco walls fragile as an unearthed bone. Seen from above, the grid is beautiful and terrible. 13. 4 of the young man's photographs became the definition of this suburb and then of suburbs generally. The photographs looked down before the moving vans arrived and before you and I learned to play hide and seek beneath the dangerous oleander trees. Architectural critics and urban theorists reprinted the photographs in books with names like God's Own Junkyard. 40 years later, the same 4 photographs still stand for the places in which most of us live. The photographs are images of the developers' crude pride. They report that the grid, briefly empty of associations, is just a pattern predicting itself. The theorists and critics did not look again 40 years later to see the intersections or calculate in them the joining of interests, limited but attainable, like the leasing of chain stores in a shopping mall. 16. My father's kindness was as pure and indifferent as a certain kind of saint's. My father did not have a passion for his giving. It came from him, perhaps after much spiritual calculation, as a product might come from a conveyor belt. The houses in this suburb were built the same way. As many 100 a day were begun between 1950 and 1952, more than 500 a week. No 2 floor plans were built next to each other. No neighbor had to stare into his reflection across the street. Teams of men built the houses. Some men poured concrete into the ranks of foundations from mixing trucks waiting in a mile-long line. Other men threw down floors nailed with pneumatic hammers, tilted up the framing and scaled the rafters with cedar shingles lifted by conveyor belts from the beds of specially built trucks. You are mistaken if you consider this a criticism either of my father or the houses. 27. You leave the space between the houses uncrossed. You rarely go across the street, which is 40 feet wide. You are grateful for the distance. It is as if each house on your block stood on its own enchanted island, 50 feet wide by 100 feet deep. People come and go from it, your parents mostly and your friends. Your parents arrive like pilgrims, but the island is remote. You occasionally hear the sounds of anger. You almost never hear the sounds of love. You hear always at night the shifting of the uprights, the sagging of the ceiling joists, and the unpredictable ticking of the gas heater. 28. What is beautiful here? The calling of a mourning dove and others answering yard to yard. Perhaps this is the only thing beautiful here. 45. The streets in my city are a fraction of a larger grid anchored in Los Angeles. That grid was laid out in September 1781. The Los Angeles grid is a copy of one carried from Mexico City to an anonymous stretch of riverbank by Colonel Felipe de Neve, governor of California. The grid the Spanish colonel carried to the non-existent Los Angeles in 1781 originally came from a book in the Archive of the Indies in Seville. That book prescribed the exact orientation of the streets, the houses, and the public places for all the colonial settlements in the Spanish Americas. That grid came from God. 46. "Stop counting, Mother," I said, bending over her hospital bed, and she stopped on 3. All afternoon she had been telling numbers as she died. She kept saying, 3, 2, 5, 3, 2. I said, "Stop counting, Mother," and she stopped again on 3. What were they? Were they a telephone number or a street address? They were coordinates for a map I did not have. 56. My father died behind a well-made wooden bathroom door. It is a 3-panel door. Each panel is nearly square, 21 inches wide by 19 inches high. From edge to edge, the door is 28 inches wide. All the original doors in the house are the same, grids of 3 rectangles surrounded by a raised framework. Painted white as they are now, each square of each door is molded in the light by a right angle of shadow. The doors in my house are abstract and ordinary. The bathroom door is now 47 years old. My father was 69. 65. These houses went up cheaply on fields cut to stubble only hours before construction began. Veterans needed no down payment, and the Federal Housing Authority guaranteed loans at 4% interest for up to 30 years. Non-veterans paid $695 down. Mortgage payments began at $46.98 a month for a 2-bedroom house and $53.50 for one with 3 bedrooms. The 2-bedroom house sold for $7,575. The 3-bedroom house sold for $8,525. The first unit of the new subdivision was ready for sale in March 1950. Rows of concrete foundations surrounded by the one remaining beet field where the ground had been broken for the shopping center. The developers were anxious to identify their development, so remote from any city. They put a steel oil derrick at the edge of the last field, mounted a war surplus beacon at the top, and strung the derrick's legs with more electric lights. At night, 100 feet above the implausibly level ground, the light could be seen for miles. 66. Buyers did not require encouragement. When the sales office opened on a cloudless Palm Sunday in April 1950, 25,000 people were waiting. Almost as many showed up on Easter Sunday and the weekends through May and June. Couples waited in line to be led in and out of a row of 7 model houses, the first time that a street of model houses was used to sell a subdivision. Young men from the nearby junior college, recruited from the athletic department, acted as guides to the unfamiliar experience. The Aaron Schultz Furniture Store in Long Beach furnished the models. Each model was decorated in one of 4 styles: maple, traditional, modern, and provincial. At night, the model houses were lighted by rows of flood lamps. The 7 model yards were planted with mature shrubs and full lawns. The landscaping made the houses look about 3 years old. Buyers waited in a second line, some watching their children on the new asphalt in a supervised playground. When it was their turn, they went inside the barn-like sales office with its displays of floor plans and rows of cubicles, each with a desk faced by 2 chairs. 69. The sales force was 35 young men. On weekends, when most of the houses were sold, a salesman worked day and evening shifts from 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. The salesman did not encourage buyers to linger. Husbands and wives selected a floor plan, signed a sales contract, looked at a map of the tract, and accepted the house they were assigned. The salesman got a $35 commission on each sale. In the office, among displays showing construction photographs and sales brochures, the houses may have retreated slightly. If the buyers hesitated, astonished at what they were about to do, the salesman looked past them to the line of other husbands and wives watching their children in the bright light. 70. Some buyers came back to the construction site on the next weekend to see their house. They picked their way through the confusion of sandy streets, past quiet road graders and stacks of pre-cut lumber, looking for their house by the symmetry of its floor plan. There were 14 of these at the beginning, with 21 exterior designs and 39 combinations of stucco and wood trim. Buyers tried to match the skeleton of Douglas fir to the watercolor rendering of the model in the sales brochure, with its printer's processed blue sky and spindly eucalyptus tree. As explained in the brochure, their house came with a Waste King electric garbage disposer, oak floors, service porch, stainless steel kitchen counter, and a stainless steel double sink. Each house would have a tree chosen by the developers planted in the parkway in front of it. This was, quote, the city as new as tomorrow, unquote. 73. A reporter for the local paper interviewed an average resident of the new suburb. He lived on Hayter Street. He had a wife, a son, and a daughter. He was 32. He earned $4,400 a year. Including property taxes and insurance, he paid $70 a month for his three-bedroom house. He paid $19 a month on his new television set and $48 a month for his new furniture. His wife knew only her next-door neighbors until she joined a sewing club on her block. There she met 5 more of her neighbors. He and his wife were registered Democrats, but they had voted that November for Eisenhower. He said he and his wife were looking for a church, but they didn't know which one. They wanted to get involved in the community, he said, but they wanted to get the grass growing in their front yard first. 80. My house is largely a void. The emptiness is not just in the span of the rooms or in the attic and foundation spaces. All the walls are hollow, too. Houses in Southern California are built as sketchily as possible while still able to shed rain. Walls are a thin cement skin over absence. Roofs are important here, but only when it rains. The rest is for modesty. 89. I have a photograph of my father sitting on the lawn of his house playing with my brother. Behind him, the wood railing of the porch was unobscured by pyracantha bushes. Over the years, the pyracanthus swelled out of the limits of the garden. Both my parents are dead. My older brother moved away to repair cars. I live in the house that belonged to the 3 of them, the house my parents bought for $6,700 and into which my brother was born as their first gift. I've taken their places, displacing everything of theirs except the way in which they succeeded in fitting in to this small house before I was born. My brother and I, who shared a room for almost 20 years, slept in identical beds. Our bedspreads were always the same. We slept east to west in our room and less than 14 feet from our parents in their bedroom at the front of the house. Only once did I hear their lovemaking, although I was a fitful sleeper and lay awake hours every night looking up at the ceiling, imagining other houses in which to live. Now I sleep better in this house, and I am grateful. 90. After work at City Hall, I walk home on straight, flat sidewalks. Their lines converge ahead of me into a confusion of trees and lawns. The sidewalk is 4 feet wide, the street is 40 feet wide, the strip of lawn between the street and the sidewalk is 7 feet, the setback from curb to house is 20 feet. This pattern of asphalt, grass, concrete, and grass is as regular as any thought of God's. 93. The question really was, who could be trusted to buy these small houses? Characteristically, the developers did not bother to answer it. The subdivision's sales manager said in 1951, "We sell happiness in homes." His salesmen sold 30 to 50 houses a day and more than 300 during one weekend when the first unit of the subdivision opened. At one point, salesmen sold 107 houses in a single hour. They sold 7,400 houses in less than 10 months. Buyers needed only a steady job and the promise that they would keep up the payments. 94. Sheetrock panels cover the interior walls of my house. Paint covers the plastered sheetrock. The walls have been painted white for more than 30 years. When my mother left the house to die in the hospital nearby, congestive heart failure had swelled her legs and feet and made her clumsy. She sat on the edge of her bed and could not dress herself on the day she left. My father was outside readying the car. I waited in the hallway at the doorway to my room. At the last moment, she found a new fear. "Don't come in," she said to me. "I'm not covered." She called out to my father, who came to the front door. "He can't come in," she said. "He would see me." My father came back inside to help her dress in a clean nightgown and to keep from me the sight of my mother. I was 31. After my father died, I had the rooms painted white again. 102. I work late at City Hall and I walk home in the dark. Sometimes I work late on Sunday. At 10 p.m. on Sunday, walking home on the sidewalk bordering the access road designed to separate the highway from residential streets, I was stopped. A car slowed and pulled up to the curb at the corner of my block. I turned and walked toward it automatically. I am always being asked directions because I am almost always the only pedestrian. A young man quickly stepped from the car. He pointed a gun at my chest and asked for my wallet. I said, "I'm sorry, I don't understand you." As I said this, I decided to fall backward onto the lawn of the corner house. As I fell, I may have looked like someone who had just been shot. Nothing else happened. The porch light of the house behind me came on. I heard the door of the car close. I heard the car drive away. I lay still for a few minutes longer, looking up at the stars in the clear sky through the limbs of a leafless jacaranda tree. 118. Louis Boyer, Mark Taper, and Ben Weingart built the city I live in and where I work. The three men built 17,500 houses in less than 3 years. Time magazine said in 1950 that it was the largest housing development in the world. The three men bought the land with a loan from the Prudential Insurance Company and began building the houses with money from an investment syndicate. The Federal Housing Authority put up more than $100 million in construction loans and mortgage guarantees. With more of Prudential's money, Weingart began building one of the nation's most successful suburban shopping centers. It was 3 times as large as the Northgate Shopping Center, which opened in 1950 outside Seattle. Weingart Shopping Center was a model for suburban retailing for the next 30 years. Thousands of duplicate shopping centers repeated its level acres of parking lots, pedestrian mall, and the 300-foot setback that separates stores from the highway. That 300-foot distance is what separates a shopping center from Main Street. In 134, in 1950, Time magazine described the construction of the first unit of 17,500 houses going up on what had been Beanfields. Time magazine described one of the developers, Louis Boyer, as, quote, swarthy, unquote, and, quote, shy, unquote. The meaning of swarthy was clear. It ended any speculation if Boyer was a Jew. When the three developers bought the Montana Land Company's empty fields, the sale included the remaining house lots around the company's golf course. In the 1930s and 1940s, the Montana Land Company made it very clear to in its promotional material that its lots were protected by, quote, restrictions of an all-inclusive nature. Written into deed covenants, these restrictions prevented the sale of Montana Land Company lots to Negroes, Mexicans, and Jews. In 1948, the Supreme Court made racial restrictions in property ownership unenforceable, but covenants, including those against Jews, continue to be written into deeds in many cities, including Long Beach. Neighboring property owners could still sue for lowering property values if a seller violated the unenforceable racial restrictions. In 1953, the Supreme Court made homeowner lawsuits to enforce racial covenants unconstitutional. 135. Louis Boyer, Mark Taper, and Ben Weingart bought the Montana Land Company's empty subdivision in 1949. It was a suburb in which they could not live. 172. The critics of suburbs say that you and I lead narrow lives. I agree. My life is narrow. From one perspective or another, all our lives are narrow. Only when lives are placed side by side do they seem larger. 173. Mrs. R. and her husband lived across the street. They had a daughter born a few months before my brother. They were Episcopalians. My mother and Mrs. R. were friends. They spent afternoons in each other's houses while my mother waited through her first pregnancy. One afternoon, Mrs. R.'s baby stopped breathing. Mrs. R. came to my mother's front door in tears, helpless. Neither Mrs. R. nor my mother had a car. Neither could drive. Few women in the neighborhood could. It was 1946. Neither house had a telephone. My mother, heavy with her baby, ran across the street into Mrs. R.'s house. She picked up Mrs. R.'s daughter. She walked into the kitchen and turned on the faucet. She cradled the dead baby in her arm against the curve of her stomach and cupped her hand into the stream of water. With a little of the water, she baptized the baby. It was all she could do. 186. Louis Boyer's wife told her husband to redesign the street plan he had sketched. She wanted him to add parkway panels and parallel service roads to separate the residential streets from highway traffic. She told her husband that children liked to play in the street and how dangerous the streets were in Chicago, where she grew up. When construction began in 1950, the Los Angeles Daily News said the new community was, quote, scientifically planned, unquote. 191. In 1953, a reporter for Harper's Magazine asked young wives living in my suburb what they missed most. The women generally replied, quote, my mother. That's an interesting reaction. 220. Joseph Smith drew the plat of the city of Zion in 1833. His drawing showed a city 1 mile square, divided by streets 132 feet wide. The streets made residential commercial blocks of 10 to 15 acres each. This grid could grow forever over level ground, unvarying as the number of saints increased. The city of Zion was built twice, in Missouri and Illinois. These Mormon towns were attacked and their Mormon prophets lynched. Brigham Young took the remnant of the saints into the wilderness of Utah. There he laid out the last city of God. 215. The grid limited our choices exactly as urban planners said it would, but the limits weren't paralyzing. The design of this suburb compelled a conviviality that people got used to and made into a substitute for choices, including not choosing at all. There are an indefinite number of beginnings and endings on the grid, but you are always somewhere. 231. Marshall Boyer was Louis Boyer's son. He named the new streets in the subdivision his father was building. He named Joanna Avenue for Joanna Dobkin, the daughter of his father's lawyer. He named Flangel and Frankel streets for two former classmates, Harold Flangel and Jerry Frankel. Boyer said he had a hard time telling them apart in school. He named Hackett Avenue for the comedian Buddy Hackett. He named streets for movie actors Gene Hersholt and Gene Autry. Streets named McKnight, Volk, McManus, and Schroll honored the men who arranged the financing for his father's company. He named Gloria Street after an old girlfriend. He named De Boyer after his wife. Allred and Dollar Streets were named for servicemen reported missing in action in Korea. Bomberry Street was named for Sergeant Robbie Bomberry, who survived a North Korean massacre of captured American soldiers and returned home. He named Freckles Road after a dead Cocker Spaniel run over by a car. Boyer named streets Dwight, Eisenhower, Mamie, and Nixon. Because Eisenhower already had streets named in his honor in cities nearby, the county engineer directed Marshall Boyer to choose different names. Boyer was allowed to keep Nixon and Mamie. 232. Marshall Boyer considered naming streets Stevenson and Adlai, but after Eisenhower's election victory in 1952, Boyer changed his mind. 233. Robbie Bomberry's daughter, who lives in Illinois, wrote City Hall with the news of her father's death. She wanted to remind city officials that a street had been named after her father and that he had been a hero. 237. I live on Graywood Avenue. The next street west is Hazelbrook. The first street east is Faculty. These three streets, with about 140 houses, are bounded by Hedges Street and South Street. All my friends came from within the rectangle of these 3 blocks. that I could reach without crossing an intersection. From age 6 to 13, I spent part of every day and nearly all summer in the company of my brother and other boys who lived in houses like mine. The character of those 7 years is what makes a suburban childhood seem like an entire life. 2:38. My brother and I played Monopoly with the boy across the street and the 3 brothers who lived 1 block east. We would begin the game on the morning of one day. It might end after long breaks and arguments and reconciliations 2 days later in someone else's house. We made the rules up as we went along to keep the game going as long as possible. 2:39. When we played Monopoly, we stretched out the game by doubling the money in the bank from other sets. We let players go into debt, ignored fines, allowed players to mortgage properties to each other, and forgave rents. Late in the afternoon on the second day of one of these games, we would lose the point of playing. We moved the metal tokens around the board and realized that no one could win under these rules. By consent, the game ended when the first player was finally called to dinner. 2:47. My city doesn't have a cemetery. Louis Boyer didn't include one in his plan. It won't ever have one. There's not enough empty space left to lay a cemetery out. Most of the Catholic dead of my city lie in All Souls Cemetery. The cemetery is in Long Beach on the other side of a railroad track. The Catholic cemetery isn't very big. It's a rectangle of land between a neighborhood shopping center and a former milk processing plant. The cemetery grounds are level. There are no monuments on the expanse of lawn. There aren't many trees. The layout of the cemetery streets is a simple grid of connected ovals. 100 feet beyond the last row of graves at All Souls Cemetery, across the railroad tracks to the east, are the backyards of the houses in my city. The row of house roofs makes a dark, irregular pattern punctuated by the crowns of mature trees. It was traditional in Christian burials that the dead lie east to west in their graves. The dead face east. It is from the east, from Jerusalem, that Christ is expected to come to raise the dead. Not all the graves in All Souls Cemetery are oriented this way. The graves of my parents, by chance, face east toward the city in which I live. 2:06. When I walk to work thinking of these stories, they seem insignificant. At Mass on Sunday, I remember them as prayers. 2:52. Sometimes I think the only real forces here are circumstance and grace. 2:81. It is unlawful to tell the future in my city. One of the oldest ordinances in the city code book, adopted when the city incorporated in 1954, lists the illegal practices by which the future may not be foretold. It is illegal to furnish any information, quote, not otherwise obtainable by the ordinary processes of knowledge, by any means of any occult psychic power, faculty, or force, clairvoyance, clairaudience, cartomancy, psychology, psychometry, phrenology, spirits, seership, prophecy, augury, astrology, palmistry, necromancy, mind-reading, telepathy, or by any other craft, art, science, talisman, charm, potion, magnetism, magnetized substance, gypsy cunning or foresight, crystal gazing, or oriental mysteries. And now to bring this portion of this postmodern vaudeville to a bit of a close. These are the last 3 sections of my book. 3:13. The ceremonies for Holy Thursday include washing the feet of 12 men of the parish in commemoration of Jesus, who had washed the feet of his 12 apostles. My father arranged for the men to be in the sacristy and directed them to 2 rows of folding chairs on either side of the altar. When I was a boy, I served with my brother on Holy Thursday. One of us carried the pitcher that held warm water. The other carried the basin that caught the water poured over each man's right foot. The foot washing was awkward for both the men and the priest. It required the men to strip off a shoe and sock from a foot that had already been carefully washed at home. The priest had to bend down nearly to his hands and knees to reach the white feet projecting from dark pant legs. One altar boy positioned the basin under the man's extended foot. The priest poured a small amount of water from the pitcher the other altar boy handed him. The priest quickly wiped off the water with a towel, stood up, stepped to the next man, and got down on his knees again. When my father died, I did not take his place as unofficial sacristan. I did have my right foot washed on Holy Thursday night. 3:14. On Good Friday, the services are shortened. No Mass is said. The priest and the congregation read one of the gospel accounts of the crucifixion. A narrator reads the descriptions. The priest reads the words of Jesus, and other readers take the parts of Peter and Pontius Pilate. The congregation reads aloud the words the crowds are supposed to have said. Near the end of the service, after the readings, the congregation participates in the veneration of the cross. Altar servers bring 3 or 4 large crucifixes from the sacristy and take them down to the first step in front of the altar. Each server holds a crucifix forward so that the feet of the figure of Jesus on the cross are in reach of someone kneeling on the first step. Another server holds a small starched square of white linen. 3:15. When I was a boy and served on Good Friday, the lines of congregants stretched to the back of the church. There was no distinction about who could participate in the veneration of the cross. Mothers and fathers stood with their small children waiting in line. They came forward, genuflected briefly on the first step in front of the altar, leaned forward and kissed the feet of the figure of Jesus on the cross. If I was holding the cross, I tried to keep it as steady as possible. If I was holding the square of starched white cloth, I was supposed to wipe the feet of the figure. I wasn't sure if this was reverence or had something to do with hygiene. As the members of the congregation venerated the cross, the cloth I carried grew bright red from the lipstick I wiped from the feet of Jesus. And finally, 3:16. While the congregation knelt and venerated the cross, the choir sang. The hymn they sang was Pange Lingua, a hymn traditional for Good Friday. Among its many verses are some addressed to the cross itself. Dulce lignum, dulcis clavos, dulce pandus sustinet. Sweet the wood, sweet the nails, sweet the weight you bear. I'd like to suggest to you, by having read that to you, that a personal narrative, an assemblage of memories, stands against the controlling power of erasure and substitution. Locating memory in built spaces, to quote Doris Hayden in The Power of Place, quote, makes visible the forgotten parts of a place. It's my impression that the built landscape is in part memory made visible. Personal narratives stand against the tendency to placelessness, abstraction, and the convenience of nostalgia. The nostalgia industry doesn't have much use for my suburb and its working class lookalikes. They don't match Hollywood's version of suburbia because the streets in my suburb don't look like the streets in Leave It to Beaver. Location scouts used to come to my town 2 or 3 times a year looking for a, quote, typical 50s suburban street, and they never did find one. I have the impression that the disturbing quality of life in Los Angeles that many commentators remark on, and perhaps the tendency of Los Angeles to go up in flames from time to time, reflects a tragic failure of memory. Now, so far in this reiterative postmodern vaudeville I've been presenting, you've seen my suburb depicted as, the word I use, pornography. You've heard me narrate it as a personal collection of personal memories. Now we're going to look at a video and see what I might regard as an assemblage of public memories. And I ask you to bear with this. This room is very alive acoustically, and we did our best to make the soundtrack of the video work. Some portions of it may be a little hard to follow, and we'll have that happen now.
When we came down here, of course, this was all open fields in the area, and I'm sure others have mentioned that to you. We could drive along Carson Avenue, and you could look over to your left if you're going east and see MacArthur Elementary School across these open fields. And gosh, there was nothing in the interrupt your view.
There wasn't anything between Harvey Way and South Street when we moved there, other than the old ranch houses on Arbor Road by the water company. And there was a horse stables over there then, too.
We used to go down to downtown Long Beach, or go down Clark Avenue. And it seemed like mile after mile, but it wasn't that far, of course. There was nothing except the fields. Yeah.
All of a sudden, the Lakewood Park people bought all of the land from the Montana Land Company, which consisted of from South Street down to Palos Verdes or thereabouts, and came out with this announcement that they were going to build this city.
And I told them what we were going to do, and one of them got up and said, well, we've been hearing about 18,000 houses and off-street parking for 12,000 cars and all these new homes. I want to ask one question. Who are you going to sell those homes to? The Gophers and the Beanfield? And everybody roared. And boy, I went back to my dad and I said, gee, is Ben Weingart know what he's talking about? He said, if Ben said he'll do it, he'll do it.
So when I came back, all these little houses had sprung up like mushrooms. And the mall was there. I saw all the lights over at the maid company. I couldn't believe it. It was really like seeing a fairy tale take shape in front of your eyes. You just couldn't believe that it went up that fast. You know, and then all of a sudden the grass grew and the trees were planted, and here you were.
They were selling them like mad. Yeah, you'd go in the office. You didn't even get to see the house. You went in the office, you saw the model. You went in the office, and when you buy that house, they put a little pin up on the wall. A red pin or a pink pin, and you'd look at that wall and think, well, that's your house. Well, where is it? So you go over there where it was, and there was no streets there. There was no nothing. Just maybe a foundation that they were pouring.
I mean, it was just astonishing. And all the houses, I mean, up one street and down the other were all these framed houses going up.
So we could come down and drive around and see what was happening, and I can remember my folks used to say, Lakewood's going to be a slum within 5 years.
I think the down payment was about $750, and I think our monthly payments ran about, initially, just under $60. So we thought we could handle it.
We came back to Lakewood and bought and moved in a week later. You tell them when you're moving, and they sent a cleanup crew in the day before that washed all the windows and cleaned the floors, and so it was ready to move in.
Oh, and a cute thing about the houses, when you bought them in those days, you didn't get any color combinations, and they dumped the tile off in front of the house, and you go out in the middle of the night, and you change the color from the neighbor's house to your house, so you'd get the color you wanted, and then maybe the next night the guy would come out and change them again. So they didn't give you any choice in colors of tile or flooring or anything in those days.
The Lakewood shopping area was still unpaved in the back. It was just a huge half-mile long field, plowed field.
Oh, it was great, yeah. because it was one of the first malls. As you know, the city of Lakewood, with this mall they had, it wasn't covered at the time, but it was a great mall, a great place to go.
So I remember Lakewood Mall when it wasn't a mall, when we had the old Butler Brothers, and Savon was next to Butler Brothers, and we always went in and got an ice cream every time we came over and went shopping.
Well, we tried to publicize Lakewood as much as possible. We were averaging 60 families a day moving in, and that was about what the sales were, too. And to try to illustrate that, I called up all the moving companies, and not one turned me down. And I think we had 21 different moving vans, from Beacons on down. And they came out, and to illustrate this, we'll just line the trucks up at each house. And people would move their furniture out and in. And the life guy got up with a cherry picker and took the photograph.
How this new community of Lakewood handled the problem of diversity, a problem which we struggle with today. And yes, in my neighborhood, that experience meant that Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, who never had lived together before, had to discover how to live together. Young people from all over the country. Bear in mind that most of my neighbors were from the border south. They were from Texas and Oklahoma and Arkansas and Tennessee. And these people in the new neighborhoods of Lakewood had to struggle with a lot of issues of diversity in their own way, as acute to them as our issues are today. Issues of faith and background and culture, even issues of language. We didn't all speak exactly the same language. But we still learned to live together.
And they were talking about this movement on the part of Long Beach to annex the Lakewood area.
A man by the name of Bud Wentz, who was an assistant to the city manager in Long Beach, came out with a proposal whereby all of Lakewood would be annexed to Long Beach by a piecemeal process where they would come up 1 week with an election in one district and another week an election in another district. And they figured that we wouldn't be able to resist the annexation.
Long Beach had a good idea of the old divide and conquer thing. They started 17 different annexation attempts.
Ben Weingart's public relations man, Don Rockland, came forward and suggested that we resist the annexation. And he appealed to me to come up with some way to fight this piecemeal annexation, and that's when I came up with the idea of protest petitions.
They got together and carried petitions and did things that I never thought they would do.
So myself and Angelo Marcaboni, who was also a young attorney in Lakewood, we started going to court and getting each of these annexations invalidated. And we had a phenomenal success in defeating the annexations.
One thing was to fight the annexation, but the other thing is, what are you going to offer in its place? And what would you suggest as far as how your government, the government is going to be run, because we wanted something of our own.
I wanted to have a separate town for my family. And I don't remember why we were anti-Long Beach. It wasn't that so much as that we were just for a new community.
Imagine, these were people who came from all over the United States. They'd passed through here during service, a lot of them, and they decided they liked it and they wanted to settle here. So they had no particular allegiance to Long Beach. So I think they were very open and accepting of the idea.
We weren't too sure whether we were for it or not when they first started talking about it. And the first one that came around was John Todd. And at the time, he lived over on the next street. And he was going door to door with the petition.
And I was curious about it. And I was trying to find out about it from what I read in the paper. And then this Avon lady came to my door, because everybody came to your door, you know. They were selling everything. And she came to the door, and I said, well, do you happen to know what this is all about? And she said, well, my brother-in-law is part of the group, and they're going to have this meeting, and why don't you go? So I did.
and that was it. Then I became involved.
I was working at Douglas Aircraft, and we'd fight every day over there about whether we should go in with Long Beach or have our own city, because it was going to be put to a vote, a referendum vote. And we'd fight and argue. One guy said, oh, you got to go in Long Beach. They've got all the services. And I would fight the other way and say, yeah, but they wouldn't give us any good services out here. It would be more to our advantage to have our own city.
Then we had this series of coffee clutches, meetings about every 2 blocks where we'd come and talk to the people. It'd show them a movie that we made about Lakewood.
They wanted to govern their own lives. They didn't want someone else telling them what to do.
Don Rockland, he was like an agent provocateur, He'd go around from group to group because there were these like little cells, that were all over town. And he'd just sort of keep the pot boiling. He might end up at your house at 1 o'clock in the morning with a quart of ice cream and some exotic food and sit down in your living room and, talk some more. He was just like that. But, it made you feel as if you're part of this big adventure. And, of course, you also see shadows behind trees sometimes, things like that. A plot here, a plot there,
Well, how are we going to have our own city? We have no fire department, no police department. So some of the lawyers and the politicians said, well, we'll lease them, we'll lease them, or however they did it. They'd contract them. It was the first contract city.
The father of Lakewood is John Todd, because he had the idea of how a city could work. You just can't start a city and who's going to pay for the street sweepers and who's going to pay for the fire and the maintenance, all of these tremendous problems.
So I just came up with the idea. I said, well, we'll contract with the county. We don't need our own police department, our own fire department, and so forth and so on. I really believed that the contracting plan was a good idea. I didn't anticipate that it was going to become the father of so many cities following it.
We were nervous. I think everybody was, on both sides. These same houses where we'd had these little coffee clutches and were neighborhood headquarters for making sure that people did get to the polls. We felt from our studies that if there was a large turnout, that we would win the election, and that's what happened.
It was a marvelous experience where we demonstrated that people getting together could really make a difference.
John Todd, whom I'd never seen smoke much, if at all, had cigars that night, and he offered a cigar to my wife, who smoked a cigar at the pool party. She never smoked before in her life, and she smoked a cigar. Of course, she didn't smoke it very long, but she did try it.
Lessons learned on the street with your neighbors about getting along were ultimately transferred to experiences in the political arena, in the formation of a city in 1954, and its maintenance as a viable, active community since.
Well, they were all veterans, too. Or 90% of them were veterans. So we had a lot of camaraderie in the neighborhoods. And then another interesting thing, I thought that pretty soon all the women, for some reason or other, got pregnant. And my wife tells me that every woman in the neighborhood was pregnant.
When we first moved in here, it was a very young neighborhood. The population was very young. I think the water we had was very conducive to having children, because we don't know what else could be. Everybody on the block had 2 or 3 children.
They were like flocks of birds. We all had, quite a few children. And when we finally got our swing set up, it was one of the few swing sets on the street. They'd sort of swoop in, and you'd hear all this noise in the backyard, and then all of a sudden you look out, it was quiet, and the swings were going like this, but they were gone. They'd gone someplace else.
Every family had, it seemed like 3 kids that were all around my age. You could go through each household on the street, and there was like a kid older than you, a kid your age, and a kid younger than you. We were a very sports-oriented neighborhood, the kind of thing where there was a cul-de-sac with the diamond painted in red paint down the middle of the street with the perfect batter's box, and if you hit it into Billy Parker's backyard because he had the mean dog, you were out, because you lost the ball for us.
I remember we built a tree house in one of the guys' backyards. I remember playing Army on top of a hutch, a rabbit hutch on a friend's house, and I ate M&M peanuts to the point that I got ill, and to this day I can't eat M&M peanuts. But I remember just as a kid having a great time growing up in Lakewood.
Bamboo Village was where the maintenance yard is now in Shadeway and Turner Grove. And at that time it was very rural. And the riverbed was still wild in there. There was no cement, anything around there. And there was a lot of bamboo, so a lot of kids would go over there and build these bamboo forts in there. And there was like in every neighborhood kind of had their little fort over there. So it was either, Bamboo Village or Del Val is what you did during the day.
And it was as if every mother in your neighborhood was your mother, every living room in the neighborhood was your living room, every backyard in the neighborhood was your backyard. The most characteristic experience of growing up in a suburban community like Lakewood was that freedom to float from house to house and to make every one of them as if it was your own.
I remember one time when my youngster and the boy down the street, before they started school, they'd been watching the school bus pick the kids up. And one day they disappeared. And, we used to go out every, say, half an hour and check on them or something. And we couldn't find them. And so we got in the cars and drove around. Pretty soon they came home. They decided to go to school. They'd walked over to MacArthur School.
We were the first group of teenagers to grow up in this town. And, the parents and everybody weren't used to that yet because we were the first basic group to come through. So there was a lot of interesting things going on. A lot of that American graffiti type of thing was definitely happening in Lakewood.
Like I said, I was kind of a bookworm and a nerd. And there was a gang of us, the bookworms and nerds, the guys that have your pocket protector and your white shirt and you roll up your cuffs. A lot of the folks that still live in Lakewood that remember my high school days will vouch for that.
But being Pan Am Queen and everybody knowing it, and it really gave you a status, it's, really was a fun thing. I really enjoyed that a lot. It was quite marvelous. It's just like you envisioned years ago with the convertible car, with the formals for the girls and waving and everybody friendly and happy and the streets were filled. It was quite exciting. I think that was the most fun I had, was doing that.
Digging in the dirt played a significant part in small kids' lives in the period we're talking about. Digging in the dirt was important, making stuff in the dirt. I made cities in the dirt, roads and the walls of garages and houses, and put these in and built these in gardens and other places where there was enough dirt to dig in, and did this endlessly. Maybe in response to all the city building going on around us.
Actually, it was really great because of the park system. I think that was probably the most significant thing that I remember. Boulevard Park was the park that I kind of hung around and got involved in, played sports down there with the Park League sports program. And that was a big thing for me. And kept us, my brother and I, really pretty much occupied out of trouble.
And it was a great place to live. The community was a thriving community, and the sports programs and the parks were all new, and there was a lot of enthusiasm in the programs, and coaches were great, volunteers, and everybody was participating then.
Those recreation leaders got on the phone and called dads, and that became the beginning of the Lakewood recreational program. That led to a tradition of parents volunteering to help out with their kids' recreation.
And they asked us to come over and sign up as a volunteer coach and take a team.
We were playing in the championship game, and as I was running down the sideline to score the winning touchdown, the guy pulled my flag out at about the 5-yard line. Well, I had a reaction. I just put the flag back in and kept on running, and the referee never saw it. He signals touchdown. Well, the field was surrounded by parents he couldn't see, and there was a lot of screaming and yelling, and I guess we won the game.
In 1972-73, we were saying, hey, this is not fair to our girls. They're not getting the same opportunity. So before even people came to us, we created a whole youth sports program for the girls.
I had a girl write a letter to me about how fun it was to being on our teams and how she just totally enjoyed playing softball and how she was a klutz and stuff like that, and now she feels really good. And that was one of the, I still have that letter. It was just one of the best things that to see something rewarding like that just comes out of the blue.
And I love the Recreation Department and the LYS. And I just couldn't wait until my kids could participate. And I'm so glad that nothing has changed, that the leagues and the format's the same. It's still free.
I just like playing. I mean, I just enjoy the sports, and my free time, I go to the park practice, playing football or whatever. That sport is like in season, really.
I mean, I think our community is what it is, largely because recreation has always been a high priority from the city council on down to the residents. I think it comes back to reflecting on what the community is all about.
In fact, places like Lakewood represented an enormous advance for many families, and they also represented a fit environment in which people could lead ordinary lives of dignity, and I think of some value. People invested themselves deeply in the community as park coaches, as volunteers in various organizations, as members of clubs and committees.
My personal relationship with Lakewood goes back since my entry into the department, and that my very first assignment as a trainee riding in a radio car, and I was still in the academy, was out of Lakewood Station.
But you know, I've always felt very, very safe here. Even at night when we sit out or take a little walk at night, I feel safe. I do.
The city of Lakewood pioneered a system called contracting for services. They came to our department. They were our first contract city and asked us to do their law enforcement services on a contractual basis. That was 40-some years ago.
John Todd wrote it. If you compared the very first contract and this contract, there's not many differences. There are a lot more community-based policing concepts in the contract today, and it's much more a partnership between the city and the residents and community groups and the sheriffs. They really are interested in providing the kind of law enforcement that we want as a community that represents our values. And this contract is flexible enough to be able to change with the times.
It's a really comfortable, safe feeling to be in the neighborhood. It's really nice.
There's hundreds of people involved in neighborhood watch programs. It gets them involved. You get to meet your neighbors, talk to your neighbors.
You know, when you consider a city the size of Lakewood, with over 400 neighborhood watch groups, and I think more than 30,000 people involved in the program, that this is a community where people who want to live and raise a family and are concerned about quality of life, should be here.
We have our helicopter, Skylight. That's my guardian angel.
The Lakewood pioneered the use of the helicopter, and I think was the very first time that a helicopter was ever used for a law enforcement surveillance.
It is a dimension of a policing plan that has so many advantages in fighting crime, in making people feel a little safer.
I feel really confident in our law enforcement. I feel really good that I see police cars driving everywhere. I'm happy when you can call or you have a question or you have a concern and you call the sheriff's station and they respond immediately. And they want to keep Lakewood safe, and I feel really good about that.
In the law enforcement community, volunteerism is another critical spoke, if you will, in this wheel that makes up the public service delivery system. At the close of 1995, we had that team of volunteers do over 7,500 hours of volunteer work. Now, if you were to put that on a slide rule in law enforcement dollars, that's over $500,000 in service, things that need to be done, but were done for free.
Special assignment officers don't have to handle calls. They're not dispatched from call to call where they're running all day long. They're dispatched problems. It may be a drug house. It may be credit card fraud at the mall. It could be a gang problem in one of our parks. It could be a neighborhood problem of vandalism or a neighborhood dispute. Their mission is basically to solve the problem. They make over 1,000 arrests a year, which is phenomenal, and they are just extra special deputies. They're really special.
The SANE program was designed to go into the schools and work with young people.
It stands for substance abuse, narcotics education, and she would explain to us like why not to do drugs and how to stay out of trouble and how to say no and how to stay out of gangs and that kind of stuff.
The SANE program is, in a community such as Lakewood, is extremely effective.
Reflecting on community building, as we are right now, is not an exercise in nostalgia. It is, above all, an effort to sustain a momentum begun more than 40 years ago. Lakewood residents overcame the conflicts and diversity of the past to build a successful, viable community.
Could you make a community out of basically raw land in many places? Can you get a sense of culture, a sense of a shared experience? And the people in Lakewood have more than once and continually demonstrate that that's not only possible, that's what has occurred and continues to occur.
There are a lot of people who grew up in Lakewood who want to come back here. Whether it's the parks, whether it's the way the community is run, it just seems to be a good place to raise a family. And it was interesting to see our neighborhood rejuvenate. As people who had raised their children moved out, there were those who have moved in, starting families. And it brings some vitality to the neighborhoods.
This little enclave of Lakewood, I hope that weaving that we've done will bind us together for the future. But I would hope if I look down from heaven 50 years from now that I still see people happy and see a clean area and see us moving about and seeing us doing things we've done.
Well, I think the people who live in the city of Lakewood and who work in the city of Lakewood need to remember that the quality of life in Lakewood doesn't come cheaply.
The fiscal challenges that this city faces are severe, and we're going to have to fight very hard to maintain what we have right now in comparison to what's going on around us. At the same time, I think we're faced with the kind of changes occurring in the broader society.
I don't know, I just feel like it's such a great place to raise a family. Where else can you go and just feel comfortable with your surroundings and your neighbors and your parks and your city councilman and your sheriff department? Where can you go and just have that comfortable feeling that you know you're raising your kids in the right place?
I came back because this town still has the same feel that it had for me when I was a kid, and I didn't want my younger kids to miss out on that.
Well, it was a planned community, first of all, and it was planned for young families after the war. But as it grew, it adapted to the changes. And I just think it's a friendly community, and it's got everything you could ask for.
It's what they do together that makes the community.
I think Lakewood is going to go on into the 21st century as a leader.
I think we need to just keep up some of the same values that the Lakewood community always has. They look out for one another. They care about their community. They care about public safety. They care about their parks. They care about their youth.
The city has always made a big effort to be inclusive. And that's very important.
So people have a lot of roots in their community because they have lots of involvements and entanglements and things that make the community a very special place.
I guess the beauty about the growth of Lakewood is that it's grown in a managed way. It hasn't just, grown helter-skelter. And that was the first time I had a real feeling, we're going to win. I mean, this is going to work.
The opportunity that these shared moments provide for people really to rethink through their existence and provide meaning to it and to build community is really quite heartwarming.
But the past offers stories of optimism that can carry us through the anxieties and uncertainties of struggling with similar issues in the contemporary world. Solving the problem of diversity in early 50s Lakewood doesn't tell us how to solve the problem of diversity in Lakewood today, but it gives us a model of optimism, gives us cause for hope, and that is much of the battle.
Well, you've been terribly patient, terribly patient, and very kind. Let me wind up a couple of things to end your penance and sitting on those hard metal chairs with a couple of final thoughts. I promised you a little ambling around, and I'll do that briskly, and if I'm able, and you're up to it, I'll answer some questions if I can. Let me end by suggesting first that my suburb isn't a perfect place. It isn't utopia. It isn't by any means paradise. It is an ordinary working class town. It is also the location of a significant amount of labor, the labor of memory. Let me speak a moment about faith. I recently read about a dozen new books about the development of Los Angeles and the current condition of the Los Angeles region. Among the books are some that you may have come across recently, The City, Los Angeles, and Urban Theory at the End of the 20th Century, edited by Alan Scott and Edward Soja. The History of Forgetting, I mentioned earlier in my talk, by Norman Klein. Magnetic Los Angeles, Planning the 20th Century Metropolis by Greg Heiss. And also The Reluctant Metropolis, The Politics of Urban Growth in Los Angeles by William Fulton. These are very good books, and I recommend them highly to you. I was struck that in these dozen books by authors left and right, I didn't name them all, there was almost no mention made of faith. It's as if none of the actors in the Los Angeles landscape believed in very much of anything. Of course, they were described as having ideologies, but the matter of their faith was not explored. And I wonder if that is another area of erasure of the ordinary lives of people. I increasingly believe that faith matters, and because it does, belief is part of the built landscape. Let me take note of another idea, the basis of history in Los Angeles. Another aphorism. My impression is that the basis of Los Angeles history is regret. And I commend those books to you. I think you'll find that to be borne out. Here's another related idea. The power of Los Angeles is to turn the conditions of our lives into costumes. And finally, a brief note on why LA looks the way it does. I strongly feel that Greg Heiss at USC has gotten this right. And he says in various places, including Magnetic Los Angeles, that given the minimal character of the landscape of the Los Angeles plain, the 150-year history of dispersal from centers, 50 years of planning based on progressive era principles, 30 years of federal housing policy, 20 years of marketing the idea of minimal houses to working class buyers before 1950, and a continuing, relatively convincing Los Angeles mythology of purified small towns, why are we surprised that working class buyers, independently of ideology or economics, have an unslaked preference for a neighborhood of single-family homes, for villas in their gardens, however diminished? And let me conclude with two final notes, one on irony and the other one on storytelling. My neighbors in Lakewood are not ironists. They do not look down on their lives as if from an aerial photograph. They do not see themselves from that position of privilege, which is above all an aesthetic privilege. As Cesar Agrana pointed out more than 20 years ago, the creation of a privileged class based on cultural exertion creates enormous anxiety among those who are aesthetically privileged. And that anxiety leads to a dismissal of what is ordinary. I have a feeling that irony is the fortress of the aesthetically privileged. And finally, storytelling, which I hope you might take from this lecture, this vaudevillian lecture. A couple of final aphorisms. Your personal narrative, I think, the story you tell yourself about yourself, I think this is a critical tool. Your personal narrative is a critical tool. I think narrative is a form of investigation. I think narrative is a critical capability. I also think narrative is a means of redemption. Thank you very much. You are terribly, terribly kind, and also have the Sitzfleisch of a good German word of best I've seen in years. I'm able to take a couple of 3 questions. My problem is that I am visually disabled, and I'm not able to see you out there, so I'm not sure how I'm going to do this. Can we bring the lights up? Is that at all possible? Is it able to throw the house lights on? Ah, bravo, there you all are. A question or two if you have. Anyone? I've stunned you with my eloquence. Again, thank you very, very much.